You've probably heard the saying, "I'd take a bullet for you." But I very much doubt you've heard the saying, "I'd smash a hole in the side of a burning aircraft, climb out onto the wing, and put out a fire for you." I admit it's not quite as catchy, but on a dark night in 1941, that's exactly what Sgt James Allen Ward did for his crew. The war in the West may have been thousands of miles from the calm shores of Whanganui, New Zealand, but that didn't stop 20-year-old schoolteacher James Allen Ward from volunteering in the Royal New Zealand Air Force. With the war still in its early days, it took some time for the administrative processes to catch up, and it was the middle of 1940 before Ward received his official call-up papers. In January of the following year, wearing his shiny new pilot's wings, the now Sgt James Allen Ward boarded the motor vessel Orangi and left New Zealand for the final time, as he headed to war. Arriving in the United Kingdom, Ward is posted to No. 20 Operational Training Unit based at RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland, and it's here where he learnt to fly the Vickers Wellington. Ironic really, given that just 12 months earlier he was training to be a teacher in Wellington, New Zealand. After 6 months of intensive training, by the middle of 1941, Ward is now a qualified Wellington pilot, alongside fellow New Zealander Hugh Kimpton. According to Kimpton, at the time there was just one slot available for a pilot on 75 Squadron. A coin was tossed, and Kimpton lost, so it was James Ward who travelled to RAF Feltwell in Norfolk to join the squadron. Within the Royal Air Force, 75 Squadron was something of a unique outfit. In 1938, the New Zealand government had purchased 30 Vickers Wellington bombers, and they sent a team of aircrew to England to train on the aircraft before flying them back to New Zealand. When war broke out, however, the New Zealand government made the aircraft and crews available to the Royal Air Force, who in return issued them with the number 75 NZ Squadron. Unlike most Commonwealth squadrons, who were simply attached to the RAF under the Empire Air Training Scheme, 75 Squadron were fully transferred into the RAF until the end of the war. By the first week of July in 1941, Ward had flown 5 operational missions as the second pilot to his flight commander, Squadron Leader Reuben Widdowson. The night of the 7th of July marked their 6th mission together, a fairly straightforward raid over the German city of Münster. Despite some flak and searchlight activity, the crew successfully dropped their bombs on the target. Widdowson then turns the bomber back towards England, with the route out of Germany bringing the Wellington crew across the Zuider Zee just to the north of Amsterdam at 13,000 feet. Just minutes from the Dutch coast and the relative safety of the North Sea, the crew could be forgiven for turning their thoughts to a breakfast of bacon and eggs and a few hours in bed. Unfortunately, things are about to head south. Behind the Wellington, hiding in the night sky, a Messerschmitt BF110 night fighter has been stalking the British bomber. Now within range, the pilot squeezes the trigger, unleashing simultaneous machine gun and cannon fire. In the Wellington's rear turret, Sgt Allan Box jumps into action and returns fire with his twin .303 caliber machine guns. His rounds appear to find the target, and the Messerschmitt spirals downwards into the black night sky. The attack is over in just a few seconds, but the damage is catastrophic. In the rear turret, Allan Box has been wounded in the foot, and on the right-hand wing, the fuel tank has been ruptured, causing a fire near the engine. Critically, a damaged fuel pipe is pouring aviation fuel directly onto the fire, and the entire wing is engulfed in flames. The Wellington bomber was made of a geodetic design, inspired by the legendary Barnes-Wallis. This provided immense strength and allowed the aircraft to survive extreme amounts of punishment, but even this won't be enough to stop the fire from eating through the wing. The crew realise they need to act fast. The airmen force a hole in the fuselage and use their fire extinguishers in an attempt to stop the flames, but the rush of the oncoming air means these have little effect against the intense fire. With no extinguishers left, out of sheer desperation, the crew open their flasks and throw coffee onto the flames. Fighting the controls of the Wellington, Reuben Widdowson knows it's just a matter of time until the fire eats through the wing and he loses control of the aircraft. He realises he has just one chance to save his crew and orders them to bail out. Given that the aircraft was over German-occupied Holland, this was no small decision. If the men survived the jump, they would have to find their way back to Britain whilst escaping and evading the German forces on the ground. Otherwise, they'd be spending the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. But Sgt James Ward has a different idea, and when he describes it to the rest of the crew, they can't believe what they're hearing. Ward calmly explains that there's a spare engine cover in the aircraft, currently being used by one of the crew as a cushion. If he climbs out of the aircraft and onto the wing, he could ram the cover into the engine to smother the fuel supply and hopefully extinguish the fire. The plan was every bit as mad as it was brave, but Widdowson decides even the smallest chance to get home is worth the gamble and tells Ward to get ready to pop outside. The crew get a rope from the aircraft's life draft and tie it securely around Ward's waist. Deciding this would be enough, Ward tells the crew that he's going to leave his parachute inside the aircraft. He was actually worried that it would cause drag against the oncoming airflow and pull him off the wing. The crew, however, managed to convince him that this was a terrible idea, and he eventually agrees to take his parachute with him. With the help of navigator Sgt Joe Lawton, Ward climbs gingerly out of the Astrodome. He uses his hands and the aircraft's crash axe to smash holes in the bomber's skin as he climbs down the 3 feet onto the Wellington's wing. To help mitigate the effects of the oncoming wind, Widdowson has reduced the Wellington's speed as much as he dares, but even so, the force of the oncoming airflow is terrific. James Ward later described the experience, saying, "It was like being in a terrific gale, only worse than any gale I've ever known." Eventually, he's within reach of the fire, and Ward shoves the engine cover into the hole from where the fuel is pouring onto the flames. He then rips chunks of the aircraft's fabric skin and uses it to smother the fire. Unfortunately, the sheer force of oncoming air immediately rips the cover out of the hole, but crucially, Ward has now removed all of the flammable fabric skin from the area. Before long, the supply of aviation fuel in the right-hand wing has run out, and the fire is left with nothing to burn and eventually dies out. Exhausted from holding onto the wing against the oncoming gale of air, Ward now turns his attentions to getting safely back inside the aircraft. He fights the tiredness and slowly works his way along the wing, whilst inside, Joe Lawton pulls hard on the safety rope, almost dragging him back inside. Reuben Widdowson nurses the wounded Wellington across the North Sea. At one point, a pool of aviation fuel ignites, once again causing a significant fire on the right-hand wing, but fortunately, as quickly as it started, the fire burns itself out. In spite of the damage, control issues, hydraulical and electrical failures, Squadron Leader Reuben Widdowson brings the Wellington down the approach to Newmarket Airfield in Suffolk. The hydraulic failure means that Widdowson is unable to extend the aircraft's flaps and has to land at a much higher speed than normal. That in itself is not the end of the world, but no hydraulics also means no brakes. As a result, the aircraft crashes through a fence at the end of the runway before coming to rest in a hedge at the airfield boundary. The Wellington, number L7818, would never fly again, but most importantly, all 6 airmen had made it home. After the event, Ward played down the incident, saying, "I can't explain it, but there was no sort of real sensation of danger out there at all. It was just a matter of doing one thing after another, and that's about all there was to it." Despite Ward's modesty, it was immediately clear to his superiors that his actions had been nothing short of heroic. 75 Squadron's commanding officer, Wing Commander Cyrus Kay, immediately recommends James Ward for the Victoria Cross, the highest possible award for gallantry. He also recommends Squadron Leader Reuben Widdowson receive the Distinguished Flying Cross and Sgt Allan Box the Distinguished Flying Medal. The awards for Widdowson and Box were approved immediately, but given the prestigious nature of the Victoria Cross, Ward's medal took slightly longer to get the green light. A month later, however, on the 5th of August 1941, Sgt James Allen Ward became the first of just 3 New Zealand airmen to win the Victoria Cross in World War II. The hype around the event was such that James Ward was summoned to Downing Street to meet the Prime Minister. During this meeting, it's reported that Ward was so overcome with emotion he found it difficult to answer the Prime Minister's questions. Churchill sympathetically said, "You must feel very humble and awkward to be in my presence." Ward just about managed to say "yes, sir," when Churchill replied, "Then you can imagine how humble and awkward I feel to be in yours." Ward was now granted a few weeks of well-earned leave, and it was during this time that fuel from a cigarette lighter was accidentally spilt onto his hand. This briefly ignited before it was put out, causing a burn to his hand. The incident would no doubt have brought back memories of holding onto the wing of a burning Wellington bomber for his life, and immediately after the fire was extinguished, James Ward fainted. It's been reported that the doctor who treated this burn gave James Ward a note declaring him unfit for flying duties, but Ward either forgot or chose not to pass this note on to his superiors. And so Sgt James Allen Ward returned to flying operations in early September of 1941, this time as the captain of his own Wellington. His second mission back was a night raid on Hamburg on the 15th of September. The mission was going well, and Ward's crew dropped their bombs on the target, but once again the Wellington was jumped by a night fighter on the way home. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the bomber was caught in a rapidly spreading and uncontrollable fire. Just as Reuben Widdowson had done only a few weeks earlier, James Ward orders his crew to bail out. 2 of the crew bail out successfully and survive as prisoners of war. In the cockpit, James Ward holds the aircraft straight for as long as he can, but the fire eventually takes over and he loses control of the bomber. James Allen Ward and 3 of his crew died when their Wellington crashed into a field just outside of Hamburg. James Ward's remarkable story has one final twist. At the highest levels of both the Air Force and government, the name Sgt James Allen Ward was being discussed. It had been suggested that Ward should return to New Zealand, where he could be used as a propaganda and recruitment tool, inspiring other New Zealanders to sign up for the armed forces. He could then remain in New Zealand to instruct on one of the local squadrons. On the 15th of September 1941, just as James Ward was taking off on his final fateful mission, the Chief of Air Staff for the Royal New Zealand Air Force, Group Captain Hugh Saunders, signed the paperwork approving Ward's transfer home. So James Ward would never see his homeland again, but he left behind the most inspiring and humbling story of just how far one plucky New Zealander would go to save his crew. If you enjoyed James Ward's story, please give the video a thumbs up. It really does help the channel out. And also, make sure you check out the story of Maynard Snuffy Smith, quite possibly the least likely person in history to win the Medal of Honor. Subscribe to the channel so you can find your way back, and I'll see you for the next incredible war story.